The feed-through rating of a 15 amp duplex receptacle is 20 amps. This is because the neutral and equipment grounding conductors are connected to the same terminal screws on both devices, and the ungrounded conductors are connected to the same terminal screws on each device. This means that the current flowing through the neutral and equipment grounding conductors is divided between the two devices, and the current flowing through the ungrounded conductors is divided between the two devices. Therefore, each device only carries half of the current that would be flowing through it if it were the only device on the circuit. Since each device only carries half of the current, it is not necessary to pigtail the ungrounded conductors. The inspector was incorrect in requiring the electrician to pigtail the ungrounded conductors. The inspector may have been confused by the fact that the receptacle is rated for 15 amps. However, the feed-through rating of a receptacle is not the same as the ampacity of the receptacle. The feed-through rating is the maximum current that can be safely passed through the receptacle to another device. The ampacity of the receptacle is the maximum current that the receptacle can safely carry. In this case, the feed-through rating of the receptacle is 20 amps, and the ampacity of the receptacle is 15 amps. Think of it this way. Firstly, the ampacity of a receptacle dictates the maximum current it can handle at a single point of use. If you plug a device drawing more than 15 amps into this receptacle, it's going to be overloaded, and that's where the risk of overheating and potential fire hazards come into play. Secondly, the feed-through rating determines how much current can safely pass through the receptacle terminals to supply downstream devices. This is where the daisy chaining comes into play. The question at hand involves the practice of using 15 amp receptacles on a 20 amp circuit, and whether the method of wiring these receptacles in a feed-through or daisy chain fashion is compliant with electrical codes and safety standards. Let's break this down further. Firstly, the National Electrical Code, or NEC, provides guidelines for safe electrical installations. It addresses issues such as conductor sizing, overcurrent protection, and equipment ratings. Secondly, the NEC aims to minimize the risk of electrical hazards, including fires and shocks. The code allows for the use of 15 amp receptacles on a 20 amp circuit under specific conditions. The key requirement is that there must be 2 or more receptacles on the circuit. This rule recognizes that the load is likely to be divided among multiple outlets, reducing the risk of overloading any single receptacle. Wiring receptacles in a feed-through configuration, often referred to as daisy chaining, involves connecting the incoming and outgoing wires to the same set of terminals on the receptacle. This method allows the circuit to continue to other devices downstream. Concerns often arise about whether this method overloads the receptacle terminals, particularly when using 15 amp receptacles on a 20 amp circuit. The feed-through rating of a receptacle is a critical factor. This rating indicates the maximum amount of current that the receptacle can safely pass through its terminals to supply other devices. In many cases, 15 amp receptacles are designed and tested to safely handle a feed-through current of 20 amps. This is because the terminals are typically robust enough to accommodate the higher current. When wiring receptacles in a feed-through configuration, it's essential to ensure that the connections are properly made and tightened. Loose connections can create resistance, leading to heat buildup and potential failure. Using quality receptacles with secure terminals is also crucial for ensuring a safe and reliable installation. Pigtailing involves splicing the wires together and connecting a short wire, or pigtail, to the receptacle terminal. This method eliminates the feed-through current from passing through the receptacle terminals, reducing the risk of overloading the device. While pigtailing is not always required by code, it can be a good practice for enhancing safety and reliability. It's especially beneficial when dealing with older receptacles or when there is concern about the quality of the terminals. The question of whether to pigtail or daisy chain receptacles often comes down to a matter of interpretation and preference. Some electricians prefer pigtailing for its added safety margin, while others find daisy chaining to be more efficient and cost-effective. Ultimately, the decision should be based on a thorough understanding of the code requirements, the equipment ratings, and the specific conditions of the installation. In the scenario described, the inspector required the electrician to pigtail the wires, citing a potential code violation. However, If the 15 amp receptacles are indeed rated for a 20 amp feed-through current, and the connections are properly made, the daisy chain configuration should be code compliant. It's important for electricians to be knowledgeable about the relevant code sections and to be able to demonstrate that their installations meet the required safety standards. In situations where there is disagreement with an inspector, it's often helpful to consult with a qualified electrical engineer or a code expert. These professionals can provide guidance and help resolve any disputes. In addition to code compliance, it's also important to consider the long-term reliability of the installation. Factors such as the quality of the receptacles, the tightness of the connections, and the potential for future load increases should be taken into account. By carefully considering these factors, electricians can ensure that their installations are not only safe but also durable and able to meet the demands of the application. In summary, using 15 amp receptacles on a 20 amp circuit is permissible under certain conditions, provided that the receptacles are rated for 20 amp feed-through current and the installation meets the requirements of the NEC. Daisy chaining receptacles is also acceptable as long as the connections are properly made and the equipment is suitable for the application. While pigtailing is not always required, it can be a beneficial practice for enhancing safety and reliability. Ultimately, the decision of whether to pigtail or daisy chain should be based on a thorough understanding of the code, the equipment, and the specific conditions of the installation. Another way to understand this is to think about it in terms of circuit protection. The 20 amp circuit breaker is there to protect the wiring from overcurrent, not necessarily the individual receptacles. The 12 American wire gauge wire used in the circuit is rated to handle 20 amps safely. The circuit breaker will trip if the total current draw exceeds 20 amps, regardless of how many receptacles are on the circuit or how they are wired. The key is that each individual receptacle must be suitable for the load connected to it. If a device drawing more than 15 amps is plugged into a 15 amp receptacle, that receptacle could overheat and fail, even though the circuit breaker may not trip. This is why it's important to ensure that the load connected to each receptacle does not exceed its rating. In a typical residential or commercial setting, it's unlikely that every receptacle on a 20 amp circuit will be fully loaded simultaneously. The load is usually distributed among multiple outlets, reducing the risk of overloading any single receptacle. However, in situations where there is a high likelihood of heavy loads being connected to multiple receptacles in the same circuit, it may be prudent to use 20 amp receptacles. This provides an added margin of safety and reduces the risk of overheating. The NEC also addresses the use of multi-wire branch circuits, which are circuits that share a neutral conductor. In these circuits, it is required that the grounded conductor, or neutral, be pigtailed. This requirement is intended to prevent the loss of neutral current, which can occur if a receptacle is removed or disconnected. The ungrounded conductors, or hot wires, in a multi-wire branch circuit are not required to be pigtailed. However, it is still good practice to do so, as it can improve the reliability of the circuit. In addition to the NEC, other standards and regulations may apply to electrical installations. These standards may vary depending on the location and the type of application. It's important for electricians to be familiar with all of the applicable standards and regulations to ensure that their installations are code compliant and safe. In conclusion, the use of 15 amp receptacles on a 20 amp circuit is a common practice that is permitted by the NEC under certain conditions. The feed-through rating of the receptacles is a critical factor to consider, as it determines the maximum amount of current that can safely pass through the terminals. Daisy chaining receptacles is also acceptable, as long as the connections are properly made and the equipment is suitable for the application. While pigtailing is not always required, it can be a beneficial practice for enhancing safety and reliability.